That professor, Beth Allison Barr, said it was a powerful teaching moment for the students and for her personally. She said that she knew women filled those verses, but had never listened to their names being read aloud, one right after the other. Phoebe, the deacon who carried the letter from Paul and read it aloud to the house church. Prisca, or Priscilla, whose name is mentioned before her husband's name, something rather notable in the Roman world, and is noted as a co-worker with Paul. Mary, a hard worker for the gospel in Asia. Junia, prominent among the apostles. Tryphena and Tryphosa, Paul's fellow workers in the Lord. And the beloved Persis, who also worked hard for the Lord. And Rufus's mother, and Julia, and Nereus' sister. 10 women recognized by Paul. Now, 7 of those women are recognized specifically by their ministry, and almost a third of the individuals greeted in Romans 16 are women, perhaps implying that about a third of the leadership of the early years of the Christian church could well have been women. Paul's criteria is this, that the names of the women who are listed there are ones who have worked very hard. They are named as deacons and apostles. It isn't hard to see that these women are not only servants in the church, but are pastors and preachers, full colleagues in ministry with Paul. And I wonder what it was like in the church where you grew up in. What role did women play? I bet women rarely appeared in front of the congregation other than to perhaps sing or play an instrument. Women could teach Sunday school, but certainly could not preach. 10 years ago, when John and I were touring the Scottish Highlands, we worshipped at a Free Presbyterian church, a holdover conservative branch of the Church of Scotland. Women were allowed to pour tea and care for the smallest children, but every other important teaching work was done by men in and out of worship, because that's what they believed Scripture required. Prior to 1966, women were not eligible to be ordained as ministers or even serve as elders in the Presbyterian Church in Canada, although they were not discouraged from taking part in other important areas of church life, like the women of the church and mission endeavors through the WMS. Perhaps your memory is like mine, that women ran the children's ministry and men ran the adult Bible studies in the congregation where you grew up too. Indeed, just 60 years ago, the only professional roles a woman could have in the church was as a female missionary or as a deaconess. And the Presbyterian use of the term, it really does mean one who is a servant of the congregation, sometimes paid, but most often not in old days, especially if she was the minister's wife. In the late 1970s, I was a student at Ewart College, the Presbyterian Missionary and Deaconess Training School. Women ministers were still a novelty, so most women seeking a church career still enrolled at Ewart to be Christian educators. We learned important skills to contribute to the faith development of Christians, but the joke remained even then that the girls who went to the Angel Factory were only interested in getting their MRS degree. It was assumed that most would catch and marry a Knox College boy who would go on to be the minister and whose career she could spend a lifetime supporting. Now, Phoebe in this story today would have been the equivalent of a female Knox College graduate and ordained minister in the 70s, at the growing edge of an inclusive leadership group in her time. Paul's letter to the Romans is regarded as his most important work, and it was Phoebe who brought this letter to Rome. There was no national postal service available to the average person in those days, so people often relied on trusted friends to carry their letters. Letter carriers did not simply just hand over the letter to the recipients. Even if the recipients could read, the carrier would likely stay and read the letter aloud. What is more certain is that the carrier often passed on additional information and personal messages from the letter writer to those who were receiving the letter. And the person bringing the letter would be in a position to field questions that the recipients might have about the contents of the letter. Now, Phoebe is the only deacon of the early church we know of by name. For anyone raised in an Anglo-Catholic tradition, you know that a deacon is an ordained leader in the church who is able to marry and bury and assist with communion, who may preach and even teach. Now, 20th century evangelical Bible translators usually use the title servant instead of deacon for Phoebe, because it was not the practice of the church, even in the first part of this last century, to imagine that women could be ministers. We always assumed that the early church was more conservative than our present modern day church, but that was simply not true. That the leadership of the early church was one that predominantly included women was a radical notion, even in its day and time. Jesus included women in his inner circle, but the church has chosen to focus on 12 men. Da Vinci's famous painting of the Last Supper with 12 men sitting on one side of the table with Jesus is the image that we've grown up accepting as almost photo evidence of that sacramental moment. Were there women there too at the Last Supper? Without a doubt. The Passover is a family meal above all. Now, Paul was a radical breaker of the rules. He invited everyone to be followers of Jesus. Jews, Gentiles, slaves, freed men and women. It's clear that Paul recognized God-given leadership in anyone, profoundly glad and grateful for their partnership in the ministry of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Priscilla, well, she wasn't just Aquila's wife. They were a missionary team from the earliest days, and they were responsible for helping Paul craft his message, making sure that it was grounded in what they knew to be true about Jesus. They set him straight a time or two, and Paul owed much to them both. A woman named Junia is mentioned in this passage as being prominent among the apostles. She's named as an apostle, for goodness sakes. I bet other than Mary Magdalene or maybe Mary of Bethany, you can't think of another woman who might be called an apostle. In fact, though, Junia's name was changed in the 20th century Bible translation from the masculine form to the masculine form of Junius. Again, because evangelical translators determined that it must have been a mistake that a female name was included there as an apostle. A woman could never have been an apostle. Well, women were the first witnesses to the resurrection, for goodness sakes. But tradition has largely omitted their leadership within the church. Not long after Paul's time, we see the emergence of letters by later writers that show the egalitarian spirit in the church waning as the years went on. The Roman patriarchal structure was reasserting itself again and continued to shape the church, especially after Christianity became the accepted state religion in the 4th century. From that time, we have a focus on scriptures that insist that women must not teach, or must remain silent, or must submit to her husband. All good Roman family values, but not the values of Jesus, and not the values that Paul exemplified. Folks have somehow missed that era, that example of fully accepted female leadership, believing instead that women were always banned from leadership in the early church, just as they are still banned from leadership in much of the modern church. The church continued to teach what it believed to be true, but it doesn't have to stay that way. The liberating work of Jesus to continue reforming the church is far from over. The mission of rescuing the contemporary church from the socially imposed convictions of the past continues today. Our denomination's landmark decision last month to accept that God can and indeed does call faithful individuals into ministry regardless of their sexual orientation or their marital status will in years come to see as natural and as normal as it does to see women like me in the pulpit. 55 years ago, the vote to accept women as elders and ministers was a close one. It was only 61%, but here I am today marking the 4th anniversary as your minister. A scandalous thought. Even the year that I was born and my grandfather was a minister to some of you good people. But we changed our mind then. And I hope most would say that it was a good decision and that the church has been blessed by the gifts of women in the pulpit for all the years since. The work of rescuing the church from our misunderstandings and prejudices continues. This is why it matters that we read aloud the names of 10 women leaders in the church recorded in Romans 16. They have been and always will be a reminder of the radical inclusion of all, despite gender identification, in the early church. And they will continue to be our inspiration for recovering the true liberty of the gospel of Jesus Christ. May our hearts and our doors be open wide to welcome all of God's beloved folk, saints, sinners, the seekers, and the saved. Now next week, we'll meet Dorothy Day, a totally radical Christian leader from the early 20th century, who was called both a communist and a Christian, but never ever wanted to be called a saint. Thanks be to God for guidance along this journey that we call life.